You are standing on a rammed earth wall in central China. It is 11:32. Below you, Jin soldiers are dragging a wooden siege tower toward the gate. The men beside you are holding something that looks almost like a spear, except the tip isn't iron. It's a bamboo tube packed with black powder, lashed to the shaft with hemp cord and a length of slow-burning fuse. Someone lights it, flame and screaming metal tear into the men climbing the tower. Nobody on this wall has a word for what they're holding. There isn't one yet, but you are looking at the direct ancestor of every rifle, pistol, and cannon that will ever be built, a weapon that will eventually put more than 1 billion firearms into circulation on Earth. And the story of how a spear became a gun is slower, stranger, and far less deliberate than you would expect. So how did humans invent the gun? Most people assume it was built on purpose, a weapon designed by a military engineer trying to kill people more efficiently. That is backwards. The chemical explosive inside every gun ever fired was not invented by a soldier. It was invented by accident, by Taoist alchemists in Tang Dynasty China, sometime before 850 AD, while they were trying to brew an elixir of immortality. A surviving text from that period, translated by the historian Joseph Needham, warns fellow alchemists against heating sulfur, saltpeter, and honey together, because several of them had already burned their hands, their faces, and in one case, their entire house down. Think about that. The substance that has killed more human beings than any other single invention in history was discovered by people trying to prevent death. They called it huiyao, fire medicine. For roughly a century, it stayed exactly that, medicine and fireworks for the imperial court. Nobody thought to point it at another human being. That changed sometime around 950 AD, when Buddhist artists at the cave temples of Dunhuang painted a demon on a silk banner, holding a tube, spitting fire. The earliest known image of what historians now call a fire lance. It's the same idea as the improvised weapon on that wall in 1132, a tube of gunpowder lashed to a spear, meant to burn or blind an enemy in the first violent seconds of contact. The fire lance didn't replace the spear. It was the spear with a chemical weapon strapped to the front of it. And by 1132, at the siege of Dian in what is now Hubei province, Song dynasty defenders used exactly that weapon in a sortie against the Jin army and drove them back. 12 years before that siege, Song officials had already written the whole thing down. In 1044, the imperial military manual Wujing Zongyao recorded the earliest known gunpowder formulas anywhere on Earth. Precise recipes mixed for cannons, fire arrows, and smoke bombs compiled at the emperor's order, so the army could reproduce the chemistry reliably instead of relying on whichever alchemist happened to be nearby. That is not folklore. That is a government document, nearly 1,000 years old, giving exact proportions of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. The state had turned an alchemist's accident into standardized military technology in under 2 centuries, and the fire lance kept evolving. In 1259, a Chinese military record describes a new refinement, a pellet wad stuffed into the barrel of a fire lance that the explosion would blast out on its own. Historians consider it the first bullet ever recorded. Not a hand cannon yet, not a gun in the shape we'd recognize. But the basic principle behind every firearm since, contain the explosion, let it fling a projectile out the end, existed in China more than 750 years ago. The tube itself took a little longer to catch up. In 1980, archaeologists in Wuwei, Gansu province, pulled a 108-kilogram bronze cannon out of a cellar, dated by context to the 1020s, during the last years of the Western Jia Kingdom, still holding an iron ball and unburned powder when they found it. In the 1970s, a team led by Wei Guozhang excavated a much smaller bronze weapon in Banlachengzi, Heilongjiang province, 34 centimeters long, 3.55 kilograms, a genuine handheld cannon made no later than 1288. It now sits in the Heilongjiang Provincial Museum as the oldest confirmed surviving firearm on the planet. And in the ruins of Xanadu, Kublai Khan's summer palace in Inner Mongolia, archaeologists found a bronze gun stamped with a serial number and an inscription that translates to a precise date, 1298. It is the oldest gun in the world that tells you in writing exactly when it was made. By then, gunpowder had already started moving west, riding the same trade routes and the same conquests that carried Mongol armies from the Pacific to the edge of Europe. Arabic manuscripts from the 1320s and 1330s describe a gunpowder weapon called the midfa, And sometime around 1330, in the Swedish province of Scania, someone cast a small bronze gun that would later be dug out of the ground as the Leuchelt gun, the oldest confirmed firearm in Europe, capable, according to modern replica testing, of driving a lead ball through medieval armor at 200 meters. 200 years after a Chinese alchemist singed his own face searching for immortality, the accident he caused had crossed an entire continent and could now kill a knight standing inside his own armor, and language kept the receipt. A gun has three core parts: the lock that fires it, the stock you hold, and the barrel the shot travels down. When something includes absolutely everything, no exceptions, we still say it came lock, stock, and barrel. You've probably said it without knowing you were describing the anatomy of a 17th century musket. For 3 centuries after the first-hand cannons, the real innovation wasn't the gunpowder. It was how you set it off. Early guns and matchlocks needed a soldier to hold a smoldering rope against the touch hole and hope the rain held off. The wheel lock, invented in the early 1500s, replaced the rope with a spinning steel wheel that struck sparks off a piece of pyrite, reliable but expensive enough that only wealthy officers could afford one. Then, around 1610, a French court gunsmith named Marin Le Bourgeois, working for King Louis XIII, combined the best features of half a century of failed experiments into a single mechanism: the true flintlock with a spring-loaded flint that struck a steel plate and a half-cock safety position so the weapon could be carried loaded without firing by accident. Le Bourgeois' design was copied across Europe within 20 years and stayed the standard for the next 230. Then, in 1836, an American teenager's wood carving became a global industry. Samuel Colt patented a revolving cylinder that let a single gun fire 6 shots without reloading, and by 1855 he had built the largest private armory on Earth in Hartford, Connecticut, with an engineer named Elisha King Root running the factory floor. Root did to guns what a Massachusetts shoe factory would later do to footwear. He broke the process into machine-cut, gauge-checked, fully interchangeable parts, so a broken piece on any Colt revolver could be swapped for a piece from any other Colt of the same model made months apart by a different worker on a different machine. Historians now treat the Hartford Armory as one of the founding sites of the American system of manufacturing, the same production logic that would later build cars, sewing machines, and typewriters. A gun taught the industrial world how to make anything identical cheaply at scale, and that speed had a cost on the other side of the equation. Full plate armor, refined over 3 centuries to stop a sword or a lance, was essentially useless against a musket ball by the early 1600s. The gun did in about 200 years what swords and arrows had failed to do in 5,000. It made armor optional. So here's the answer to how humans invented the gun. And it's a different answer than you'd get from almost any other technology's origin story. Shoes were invented independently on every continent by people solving the same problem with whatever hide or bark they had nearby. Armor was invented independently too. Bone in Siberia, linen in Greece, bronze in Sumer, all converging on the same idea by accident. Guns were not. There is no second independent gunpowder recipe discovered by someone who had never heard of the first one. Every gun on Earth, without exception, traces back through an unbroken chain to one chemical accident made by one group of alchemists in one country in the 9th century. The formula spread through trade, through conquest, through the Mongol Empire's brutal but efficient road system, but it was never rediscovered. The probability that saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal in roughly the right ratio got mixed together by pure coincidence in 2 unconnected parts of the world is close to 0. The chemistry is too specific, and the timeline of diffusion China to the Islamic world to Europe, within roughly a century and a half, is too clean to be anything but one idea traveling outward. Unlike a shoe, gunpowder isn't an obvious answer that anyone would stumble onto twice. It had to be found once and carried everywhere else. Tonight, somewhere, a hunter is loading a rifle built on a design refined for 2 centuries. A police officer is checking a sidearm descended, part by interchangeable part, from a factory floor in Hartford. A soldier somewhere is carrying a weapon whose ignition system is really just a faster, safer version of what Marin Le Bourgeois built for a French king 400 years ago. And in a museum in Inner Mongolia behind glass sits a small bronze tube, barely longer than your forearm, stamped with a date almost 700 years old, 1198, made by hands that had no idea what they were starting. It began with people trying to live forever. They didn't find the elixir, they found the opposite. and the fire they lit by accident in a mountain temple in Tang Dynasty China has not gone out since.